in the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to talk about the physiology of drug addiction. We're going to talk about gender differences. And we're going to discuss specific barriers that women may encounter when they're addicted to drugs, seeking treatment, and various other things, medical consequences, and the like. So just to level the playing field, a drug is something that is introduced into the body and causes some kind of physiologic change, and that change would be the high that people get when they are exposed to a drug in some way, whether or not it be smoking, injecting. And recreational is when you go to, say, a concert and you smoke some marijuana, or you're using it in a recreational type of purpose. And really, the buck should stop there. That's the sort of sweet spot. That's when you're dialed in. Not that I'm condoning the use of drugs, but it's pervasive in our society, and we have to acknowledge that. Now, if anyone is so, what's the word I'm looking for? Interested in how drugs have affected society, culture, music, art, I would encourage them to watch The Drug Years, which is, I think, a 4 or 5 part special. And it talks about drugs and how they were introduced in society, and things that happened with the use of drugs, including the discovery of DNA, the double helix form, where Crick was supposedly tripping out on LSD when he envisioned the double helix. And the first time I remember really thinking about, hey, there's something going on here, is when I watched Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I don't remember how old I was, but I bet some people in this room may remember it. And this was Jeff Spicoli, who was Sean Penn, who now has this sort of thing going on with El Chapo. And that was the first time I said, wow, there's something that I don't know about that I'm discovering in the movies. And then it was all on after that point with Harold and Kumar and White Castle. And as advertisement would have it, now Taco Bell is offering incentives because they have to catch up to the popularity of White Castle. And if you're high, you could get 20% off at Taco Bell. How many here have watched Narcos? Somewhat dramatized, but nonetheless a great show. This is where things start getting bad. When you abuse a drug, that's when you have the improper use of it. When you become addicted, that's when you have a compulsion to use. And then there's some other little nuances when you have the acquisition of a drug. That's when you initially sample it, and then you go on to, or may go on to, maintenance, where you're sort of a steady state, where you're doing it maybe once a day, once a week, or something to that nature, but it's well regulated. And this is where things start getting bad. Any South Park fans in the house? And then there's escalation, where you increase the dose, and that ultimately will lead to dysregulation. And obviously there's dependence and withdrawal that can occur, withdrawal being the physical manifestations with cessation of the drug, dependence being that you're taking the drug to engage in your daily activities, otherwise you don't feel good. And then this is really the crux of addiction, is the reinstatement and relapse that occurs. And that really is deeply embedded, as we'll see, in neuroplasticity. Some people may not think, but caffeine is the most commonly abused psychoactive substance, used or abused. And as we would have to have a definition or a diagnosis, the DSM-4R chimed in on addiction. And really the crux of it is that it's maladaptive. But I don't think this really defines it in its true sense, in that this puts a time period of 12 months. I would venture to say, and as we move on to the basic science of addiction, that there is something that changes in a person who is addicted to drugs. And when you talk to them, they'll say, "I'll 10 years clean," because there's always that inclination that they'll relapse, and they realize that. There's always going to be that underlying craving. And there's a great deal of time spent in activities. There's important social and occupational things that occur or that are neglected when you're addicted. And it will continue despite knowledge of persistent or recurrent physiological or psychological problems that occur with drug addiction. So the DSM-4 chimed in, but really gave a time frame for that to occur, and I would venture to say that it's much farther beyond that. There is no prototype of a person that's addicted to drug, and it varies among different cultures and groups and so forth, and among all socioeconomics, from people that are very, very wealthy to people that do not have any money that you see on the street that are asking for money so they can get a bag of heroin. 30 million or so Americans have used illegal drugs, and 40% of them are 25 to 30-year-olds. That's pretty young. That sort of implies the sort of adventurous nature of that age group. And cocaine being an expensive drug, 1.5 million abusers, 67% are employed full-time. Cocaine is expensive, obviously. You have to find money for it. And 53% of fathers, of their fathers went to college, so they don't come from uneducated backgrounds. 23% of high school seniors regularly use marijuana. That's pretty big. That's 25%. 10% of students have used an illicit drug, and 3.6 million Americans are dependent on illicit drugs. It's a big, big number. And there's a huge productivity loss, 44 billion. But the thing that sort of sticks out here is 4.5 billion in health expenditures, but only 10% used on treatment of addiction. We're dealing with a lot of the health consequences of addiction, especially alcohol, which we'll elaborate on in a bit. And the war of drugs is ongoing, and I hate to sound pessimistic, but ever since we were able to identify that there's something that can make you feel different or a person feel different, there has been a war on drugs. And there's very creative people who are constantly synthesizing new drugs. There's people who are prescribing drugs innocently, and we're creating people who ultimately become addicted. And we've made some advances with the war on drugs, but unfortunately it seems as if it's a war that we're not going to win, and we've been fighting since the 1600s. Public enemy number one is alcohol. How many people here work in an emergency department setting? And on a Friday night, how many alcohol intoxicated patients come in? Numerous. Right? Sometimes outlie the medical problems, and they're sort of sitting there on the in the stretchers and waiting to be cleared. And how many people have had a patient who has either been the victim of a person that's drunk driving or been drunk driving themselves? How many people here have had patients who are cirrhotic? How many people here have had patients who have esophageal varices from alcohol? So think about that, and think about the deaths that you hear about from other drugs, and think about the impact that alcohol has on society. And believe me, I embellish, but I embellish in a very safe manner. And the harm caused by drugs really is the most, absolutely the most, for alcohol, barring none. So don't kid yourself. Alcohol is a drug, and often when I take the HPI of patients that come in alcohol intoxicated and you ask them, do you take any drugs, they sort of balk at you. They're like, no, I don't take drugs. And I'm thinking, like, this is a drug, and this is worse for you than anything else. But technically speaking, alcohol is a solution, but it is not a solution to your problems. But technically speaking, it is a solution. And how many people have been here before? You're drinking, you're feeling good, and you're like, oh man, I'm not going to work today. But we have a lot of responsible people here in the audience. So how do we get addicted? Some statistics, which I don't know if they were covered at any point in this lecture, but either 1/3 to 1/4 of people that are given a prescription for opiates will have a hard time getting off or will become addicted. That's big. That's a huge number. And given the prescription of opiates, we're in some ways creating these drug addicts. So addiction is really when you go from social use to compulsive relapsing disorder. No one takes a drug for the first time and says, I'm going to get addicted to this. This is what I want to be. I want to drink this alcohol and do it for the rest of my life. Or I want to take this heroin and do it for the rest of my life. Nobody says that. And most often, it's a controlled social use. You have a friend who introduces you to a drug, and the next thing you know, you're meeting up with that friend again, and the next thing you know, you're addicted. But there's a tremendous interplay of various things that go into addiction, such as genetic, developmental, sociological, but it is really deeply embedded in neuroplasticity. It really changes your brain. And drug addiction is really a disease with no obvious cure. There's nothing that comes out and says, hey, we have a cure here. You're going to take this pill. Hypertension, pretty damn easy, right? You have someone who has a high renin state. You prescribe an ACE inhibitor, you're doing well. Drug addiction is not that simplistic. And we've made some progress with heroin and the use of methadone, but methadone is a drug, and people become dependent on methadone. So we're trading an addiction for an addiction that's more socially acceptable. And there will be no consistent, effective pharmacological therapy that can mitigate or halt the drug cravings in a drug-addicted individual. And the thought of simply disengaging, just stopping, really is something that is simplistic in nature, and you think it could be easy, but it's easy for us to say, but much harder for someone to do. And we know that from repeated pharmacological insults, there are changes in the brain that trigger all different things that come with addiction. In classic operant conditioning, classic animal conditioning, where you can take away a drug, not like a human, there's a couple of things that can happen. Someone is given a drug, not someone, I'm talking about an animal now, like a lab rat, is given a drug, and they may just take a little bit. Like each day I'm going to press on this little pedal, and I'm going to get a little bit of cocaine in my water, and then I'm going to go about my day. And then tomorrow I'm going to press on this pedal, get a little more cocaine, and go about my day. More often what happens is they're pressing on the pedal when it's available, and they keep on taking it, keep on taking it. Eventually there's a dysregulation that occurs. And then there's a period of forced abstinence where the drug is taken away and the animal can no longer get the drug. And then there may be a sensitization that occurs that when they get the drug again, there's much more of a euphoric effect. And that really triggers the uncontrolled drug abuse that occurs. And that really is reflective of the human model as well. There's very few people that can take a drug for long periods of time and take, a regulated dose and not escalate and dysregulate after being exposed. And there's neurological changes that occur, and there's some that are very transient, that last from hours to weeks, and there are some that are permanent. And this occurs through repeated pharmacological insult, from repeated exposure to these drugs. Now, all drugs will release dopamine, and dopamine makes you feel good and is the rewarding neurotransmitter for that matter, or chemical for that matter, with the drugs, cocaine, heroin, and various other things. Now, we know if we have a lot of dopamine, we're going to decrease our receptors. It's simply what happens in the body. Right? It happens in various physiologic properties. We have too much, so we're going to decrease the receptors because we don't need them anymore. But it's not just dopamine. There's a lot of other things that go into addiction. There's social clues, there's family stuff, there's genetic. But really what happens is you spiral out of control. There's compulsive use and so on and so forth. But the rewarding effect is going to be from dopamine, and that's really the crux of the start of the end. And from social use, when we have transient neuroplasticity, there may be a point where we can make a decision that is going to be the right decision. So you're addicted to a drug, and you're going to help your child with homework, and you choose to help your child with homework. Or you may choose, in the time where you have a compulsive relapse, that you're going to use the drug. Now, this is deeply embedded in the acquisition when you initially sample the drug, to when you have these declarative memories where you're sort of learning of how the drug makes you feel, the different social cues of when you were somewhere and you did a drug and you felt so good. And this is deeply involved with the release of dopamine from the VTA and the prefrontal cortex, as well as the nucleus accumbens. And these all sort of overlap. So you go from transient neuroplasticity to stable neuroplasticity. When you have stability in your neuroplasticity, these changes that we'll go over in a few minutes, you can get a compulsive relapse. And these relapses can be recalled in memory, so you'll always have that cue that you want to do the drug because you want to recall that effect that you have. And it's largely because of the various projections in the brain to different areas with the release of dopamine, glutamic acid, and various other things. So in the VTA to the prefrontal cortex to the striatal complex and the amygdala are areas that are sort of the simplistic way in which a drug makes you feel, and the nidus for the neuroplasticity that occurs. But increasing dopamine increases your behaviors, and those behaviors are the behaviors that you engage in to obtain the reward of the drug. We release dopamine when we do other things, not necessarily drugs. When we have some kind of learning stimulus, or we engage in some kind of activity that makes us feel good. Now, when you have a biological motivational stimulus, meaning not a drug, you release a certain amount of dopamine. But over time, that same biologic stimulus will not release as much dopamine. and you'll sort of get a tolerance, for lack of better terms. It's really not a tolerance. But with the use of drugs, you can override the amount of dopamine that you release. And every time, with maybe an increase in dose if need be, you overcome the physiological restraints and you release more dopamine. So you get more of a rewarding effect if you're inclined from something that you do, say engaging in some kind of activity. With drugs, you could get more of a rewarding effect. And I think that when people get addicted to drugs, that takes over and they don't want to engage in those other things. And they'll constantly look to get that reward from drugs. So since there's more dopamine, there's going to be some changes in the dopamine receptor. And this change in the dopamine receptor is really going to cause the changes in the brain and the neuroplasticity that's going to be intimately involved in drug-seeking behavior. You notice that when people come to your office or people come to the emergency department, they're going to ask for a prescription. I want Dilaudid, I want Demerol, I want Percocet. My back is killing me. They come in hunched over. When you tell them they're not getting it, they walk up straight and they get out of the office. We've all been there before. That's something that they can't control. I really want to understand that because it's hard not to, as a passionate person, which we all are in this room, we're physicians, it's hard to not get offended. And it's hard to not be, to sort of scoff sometimes at that type of situation. But what I learned most from this lecture is this is something that they can't control. And the way that they seek drugs is not because they want to fool you. It's not because of any other reason. Then they're addicted and they're so inclined to try and obtain the drug that this is what they have to do. So with continued stimulation of the dopamine receptor, you're going to get some downstream changes that are going to ultimately increase dynorphin, ARC, and AC1. These things mean nothing in the grand scheme of things, with the exception that with the continued exposure to these drugs, you're going to have stable neurologic changes with things that are being synthesized that weren't there before or not in the same amount that they were before. And what happens with repeated pharmacological insults, you're going to develop a tolerance. We know that. And while you're having those repeated pharmacological insults, specifically there is a compound called delta phos-B that is synthesized. And that will make it so that you're more likely to progress from social use to relapsing use. So it provides that neuroplasticity that you're using socially, and then all of a sudden now you're going to relapse and you're going to use it more. And there's something that occurs that I think is probably the most interesting point about addiction, is that in the time where you're abstaining, you're going to get this brain-derived neurotrophic factor that's going to form all these different genes and chemicals that will make it so that you can reinstate. In other words, that you always feel that you want to do a drug. And it's going to be that much easier for you to do that drug after you're abstaining and become addicted again. So there's something that occurs in the short-term period. There's a reward. From continued reward and the release of dopamine, there's neuroplasticity that occurs. And that neuroplasticity will make it so that you have changes in various genes. And those changes in various genes will ultimately lead to you becoming more of a relapsing user. And also, when the drug is gone and done and out of your system, you're always going to have that inclination to want to do it again because of various other things that are formed in abstinence. And there's a vicious cycle that goes along with it, obviously. There's preoccupation and anticipation, there's binge and intoxication, there's withdrawal and negative effect, and various other things. Men and women are not created equal, and that's, I don't say that in any way, shape, or form other than we're different, right? I think that women are superior. They have a USB port where I have a Wi-Fi antenna. Don't anyone try to tune into my Wi-Fi antenna here because it's closed and it's password protected. But the male brain and the female brain are very, very different. We know that. 15.8 million women have used drugs in the last year. 4.6 million women of age 18 or older have used prescription drugs, abused prescription drugs, addicted to nicotine during pregnancy, and every 3 minutes, a woman goes to the emergency room for a prescription painkiller misuse or abuse. Historically, addiction was really thought to be a male problem, but there's significant gender differences as far as social factors, characteristics, biologic responses, and so on and so forth. There's different progressions to dependence, medical consequences, co-occurring psychiatric disorders, as well as other things related to treatment, entry into treatment, retention, completion, as well as relapse. Now, women are more likely than men to come from families where one or more members is a drug abuser. Women are more likely to be in a relationship with a drug-abusing partner, and this is often to facilitate that intimate relationship, that they don't necessarily want to do the drug, but they're in a relationship with this individual, so they acquiesce to the use of drugs. And men are more likely to be involved in sociopathic or criminal behavior. I think that just reflects the testosterone more so than anything else. And women are more likely to engage in prostitution or larceny, and that obviously puts them at risk for sexually transmitted diseases. Men con, burglarize, and so forth. And women are more likely to be widowed or divorced if they're using drugs. Now, as far as, hey, do you get a different effect? Probably not. Maybe. We don't know. Are their brains different? Meaning, are the women's brain different? Is the decision-making changed in some way? Are there different motivations for use? And is withdrawal worse? We don't know. Maybe. Some evidence may be there, but we don't know for sure. And what are the motivators? At least with methamphetamine, weight loss is one of the big motivators for females, and among other things. Males tend to use it more to work more, for better sex, for replacing another drug, and so on and so forth. And we all remember the faces of methamphetamine, right? Remember this in the news, that this person who looks apparently healthy is using methamphetamine, and then you get a picture, 6 weeks later, and she looks like that. This young lady right here with methamphetamine, and 2.5 years later, looks like that. And then Charo, many of you might not know, but she became addicted to amphetamine. She thought it could make her play the guitar faster. She was already very fast, right? And then this happened, and who knows how, what physiologic change occurred. Absolutely mesmerizing. Science is mesmerizing. Anyway, adult men are 2 to 3 times more likely than a woman to have a drug use disorder. So you have a team, and that team is much bigger, right? And the A team, which we'll say is the male team, and the B team, which is a female team, is much smaller in numbers, but hey, they can run faster. And they're going to win the race because women tend to consume alcohol, marijuana, opioids, and cocaine more rapidly than men. So a man may start and is more likely to start, but women tend to increase the use of these drugs more often. And females start regularly self-administering illicit drugs of abuse at a lower dose, but the use escalates more rapidly. And they're greater risk, females are greater risk for relapse after abstinence than men. There seems to be an association with cigarette smoking in women and illicit drug use, and in alcohol in men, so 2 different things. Alcohol tends to be more associated with illicit drug use in men, even though alcohol is itself an illicit drug. Cigarette smoking, not an illicit drug, but or a legal drug, I should say. It is a legal drug, but association with cigarette smoking in women. And when women start drinking, they tend to seek treatment at a shorter time frame from the initial drinking and dysregulation than men. Women tend to progress faster with alcohol addiction than men. They call that telescoping, in that you sort of jump between stages, like you start drinking and then you drink more excessively very quickly. And as we said before, women are more likely to use drugs when they're in an intimate relationship. Now, women have also specific things only to them, such as infertility, vaginal infections, miscarriages, and premature delivery. And obviously, as you would suspect, that a woman who is addicted to drugs is going to have worsening outcomes and all of those different things. Now, the thing that's most staggering is there's a 50 to 100 times higher death rates than male counterparts in alcoholic women as opposed to men. That to me is staggering. And women are more likely to develop cirrhosis despite lower levels of alcohol intake. We know that. They don't have as high alcohol levels as men, but they can develop cirrhosis at lower levels. And HIV infections, 26% of all reported HIV infections are women, and 20% are related to the use of drugs, specifically sharing of paraphernalia and so on and so forth. And as far as psychiatric comorbidities are concerned, women have a higher incidence of depression. And a lot of times when people come to you and they're complaining of, a lot of different things, my back hurts, I'm dizzy, I'm weak, and they're sort of teary, you just come right out and ask, are you depressed? And sometimes you'll get the answer. Dr. Sabando does that often. We try to do that at institution. We get a lot of complaints that are sort of, non-related health complaints, and it's just because they're depressed and they don't know how to articulate the depressed. It's easy to say you have, a cough and a fever, right? It's easy to say that you have, pain in your ear, but it's much harder for someone to articulate that they're depressed. And often it's various physical manifestations that they complain about. Now, intimate partner violence is much higher in that of a woman who abuses drugs, anywhere from 25 to 57%, as opposed to the 1.5 to 16% in their counterpart that is not abusing drugs. And interpersonal stress and relationship conflicts are a major trigger for relapse. You're abstaining, and then you have some kind of interpersonal stress, and then you relapse back to drugs because it makes you feel better about things and you can't help yourself. There's so many barriers, and there's, as I said, a dearth of research on the barriers. You can't really read this, but these are various things that are published in, an illustration about the different reasons why a woman wouldn't be forthcoming with their drug use, or the other barriers that a woman may have when they're seeking treatment. Pregnancy being one of them, right? Lack of services. Fear of losing custody when a woman is a mother and doesn't want to lose a child and thinks by going into a drug rehabilitation program they're going to lose that child. Fear of prosecution and lack of affordable child care, as well as on-site, lack of availability of on-site child care, and problems related to transportation, to inadequate health insurance, to poverty, and interpersonal relationships. So these are different things that women experience when they want to be involved in a treatment program and cannot become involved because of these barriers. Now, for men, most of the time they get in through the criminal justice system and through their employers. So there's a sort of mechanism for men that are drug abusers for them to get help. For women, it's more often from a social work referral, very, very different. Some of it may reflect different programs or the amount of men in certain workplace versus others. I do not know for sure. And there's mixed findings with regards to treatment and retention. Some studies will show that women are the same as men. And at least one study published in 2002, that they're more likely women separated from spouses, poorer family social functioning, and fewer years of education. And women also report that domestic violence counseling, transportation, individual counselors, and childcare are primary reasons why they don't stay in treatment. And women-only groups would be important because women may be more likely to share certain information in women-only groups. So in order to provide services, we really have to address childcare, we really have to address transportation, and we really have to address a way to facilitate entry into drug treatment services. As far as physician barriers are concerned, there are significant physician barriers, and we have to take responsibility for some of this problem, at least. Only 1/3 of primary care physicians carefully screen for substance abuse. Only 1/6 believe they are prepared to spot illegal drug abuse. And then there may be a misunderstanding about the chronic relapsing nature of dependence. Also, physicians may not understand the intensity of which a person wants to use substances. There may be a discomfort, right, that you don't want to talk to the patient about it at this time. And how many people in here use the NJRX? That's a very sort of objective way. You just print it out and you hand it to the patient. You don't need to say anything else. Most of the time, they'll just walk out. We have that often that people come in and they say, hey, I have back pain and, I ran out of my, Percocet. And then you look and the day before they were prescribed 120 Percocets. And you're thinking like, well, And then most of the time, they just leave peacefully. But that has made our job a lot easier. But we have to do more, though. We have to have a real easy way to do point-of-care testing. Because how many people you forgot your password for NGRX? All day, every day. And then what is it? At the beginning, it was really hard to get the password. Now it's a little bit easier. But at the beginning, it was super hard. And there may be skepticism that, hey, these drug treatment programs may not work. And as I said before, you work in a busy office. It's often hard to strike up that conversation. And there's also enablers. I mean, we're all guilty of it. I mean, we prescribe the medications that people become addicted to. And we may give a work excuse. We may provide prescriptions even though we know that, of a lower dose, right? You know the person's addicted, but you're not going to give them their, 20 Percocets. You're going to give them 6, right? How many people have done that here? You don't have to raise your hand, but yeah, we do that, right? And I was driving to work the other day, and I was listening to the Sirius Channel 44, and I heard this song, and it just so happens that I was thinking about the lecture, and I said to myself when I was listening to it, wow, I got to get the lyrics to this song, so I put it in here, and this is Kevin by Macklemore. I would venture to say that he's a rapper, and probably a lot of people in this audience, I don't think, listen to rap music, although there may be some who like Run DMC or some old school stuff that we remember from high school. But anyway, it says, "Doctor, please give me a dose of the American dream. Put down that pen and look in my eyes. We're in the waiting room and something ain't right. All of this on you. We're overprescribed." And then it goes on to say that, "Doctor, your medicine and your methods can't cure my disease without killing me. You're killing me. You're killing me." Somewhat graphic, but I think that this stems from a friend of his, Kevin, who was a friend of the artist, who died from drug abuse, and it was recognized that that was from prescription drugs. So the patient may also not be forthcoming, and you may not be able to pick up on those things. So they might be ashamed, afraid, non-sympathetic. They think, a non-confidential setting, fear of government agencies, as well as the social stigmata that occurs. And it may also be subconscious that they do not really realize that they're addicted to drugs. They may not even know that they're addicted to drugs. They may not consider it being addictive. So in summary, addiction is deeply rooted in neuroplasticity. We know that something changes with repeated pharmacological insult, and that something is enduring. And you know that when you talk to somebody who has abstained and they say they're clean, that's because they always have that inclination to think that they may use again. That's really how I interpret that. Significant gender differences exist in all aspects of drug addiction, such as with cocaine, with alcohol, that there is an increase in frequency or escalation of use. And there's unique aspects that need to be addressed for women specifically with treatment, and those are related to childcare, transportation, and various things. And us as physicians, we really need to recognize, and we can facilitate drug addiction and for successful treatment. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.